Security Chief Marcus Thompson stormed across the federal courthouse lobby, barked orders at two junior guards, shoved past the reception desk, and grabbed the black woman by her arm before violently slamming her against the metal detector. "You're going through additional screening whether you like it or not," the 15-year veteran shouted, pressing his hand against her back while she calmly stated, "Sir, I am Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington, and you need to step back immediately." The racist security chief laughed until she recited his employee ID number, his supervisor's name, and the exact constitutional authority she represented, details that only someone with the highest judicial power in America would know. What Thompson didn't realize was that attacking the wrong person in the wrong place would trigger constitutional consequences he never saw coming. He thought he was dealing with just another visitor who needed to be put in her place. He was wrong. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and the price of one moment of constitutional disrespect. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon when the highest judicial authority in America collided with 15 years of unchecked security abuse at the Richard B. Russell Federal Building in Atlanta, Georgia. Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington had traveled from Washington, D.C. on what appeared to be routine judicial business, but her true mission was far more sensitive. For 3 months, her office had been receiving anonymous complaints about systematic intimidation and constitutional violations at this particular federal courthouse. Today, she was conducting an informal security assessment, observing protocols from the perspective of an ordinary citizen. At 52, Justice Washington had earned her place on the Supreme Court through a distinguished career that began in civil rights law. She understood constitutional authority not just as an abstract legal concept, but as a living protection that required constant vigilance. Her appointment to the court 5 years earlier had been unanimously confirmed, a testament to her unassailable reputation for fairness, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. What made Justice Washington particularly dangerous to someone like Marcus Thompson was her comprehensive understanding of federal security protocols. She had helped establish many of the guidelines that governed courthouse operations, and she knew exactly which procedures were constitutional and which crossed the line into abuse of authority. Security Chief Marcus Thompson represented everything Justice Washington had spent her career protecting citizens against. At 48, Thompson had built his 15-year courthouse career on a foundation of intimidation and power abuse that would have been impossible in any environment with proper oversight. His personnel file, if Justice Washington had access to it, would have revealed dozens of complaints that had mysteriously disappeared into administrative limbo. Thompson had survived and thrived because he understood how to exploit the gaps in federal oversight. He knew which supervisors were too busy to investigate complaints, which procedures could be bent without generating paperwork, and which visitors were unlikely to have the knowledge or resources to challenge his authority. But today, that system of unchecked power was about to meet its constitutional match. Justice Washington entered the courthouse lobby, wearing a simple business suit and carrying a modest briefcase, nothing that would identify her as one of the 9 most powerful judicial figures in America. She observed the security checkpoint with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades ensuring that government power served constitutional principles rather than personal ego. The metal detector area was Thompson's domain, and he ran it like a personal fiefdom. Justice Washington watched as he subjected visitors to unnecessarily aggressive screening procedures, used intimidating language to assert his authority, and demonstrated the kind of constitutional disregard that had prompted the anonymous complaints to her office. Thompson noticed the well-dressed black woman observing his operation and immediately felt his authority being questioned. In his worldview, there was a natural hierarchy that needed to be maintained, and citizens, especially black citizens, needed to understand their place in that hierarchy. "Ma'am," Thompson said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, "you need to step forward for screening." Justice Washington approached the metal detector, but instead of submitting to Thompson's aggressive procedures, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She decided to test whether Thompson's treatment of visitors violated the constitutional standards that every federal employee was sworn to uphold. "Officer," Justice Washington said, using her courtroom voice that was designed to command respect without raising volume. "I'm wondering if these screening procedures comply with the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search." The question hit Thompson like a challenge to everything he had built over 15 years. In his mind, this was a simple equation. He was a federal security chief with absolute authority over courthouse access, and she was a civilian questioning his methods. The fact that she was a black woman making constitutional arguments made it even more infuriating. "Lady, I don't need constitutional lectures from visitors," Thompson snarled, stepping closer to Justice Washington. "You're going through screening my way, or you're not entering this building." The other security officers, Jenkins, Rodriguez, and Davis, were now watching this confrontation with growing unease. They had worked with Thompson long enough to recognize when his ego was about to explode, but they also sensed something about this woman that made them uncomfortable. Her vocabulary, her complete lack of intimidation, her precise understanding of constitutional law, everything about her suggested she wasn't who Thompson assumed she was. Justice Washington remained perfectly calm, but her mind was cataloging every constitutional violation she was witnessing. She noted Thompson's badge number, 1847. She observed his nameplate, M. Thompson. She mentally recorded the time, the witnesses present, and the specific constitutional principles being violated. But what Security Chief Thompson didn't know was that the woman questioning his authority held the highest judicial authority in America, and what happened next would trigger constitutional consequences he never imagined. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two people were and why this particular confrontation represented 15 years of constitutional violations meeting their ultimate consequence. Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington hadn't always worn the robes of the highest court in America. 25 years earlier, she had been a constitutional attorney in Birmingham, Alabama, specializing in federal civil rights cases. She had built her legal career methodically, winning landmark cases against government agencies that believed their authority placed them above constitutional accountability. Her appointment to the Supreme Court had made her one of the most powerful constitutional authorities in American history. She didn't just interpret the Constitution, she was the Constitution's living embodiment, with the authority to determine what federal and state governments could and couldn't do to American citizens. What made Justice Washington particularly dangerous to Thompson was her intimate knowledge of federal security protocols. She had personally reviewed the constitutional guidelines that governed courthouse operations. She understood exactly which procedures were necessary for security and which crossed the line into constitutional violation. More importantly, she had the authority to trigger federal oversight mechanisms that could transform entire government agencies overnight. Security Chief Marcus Thompson had spent 15 years building a system of intimidation that would have been impossible under proper constitutional oversight. His approach to courthouse security wasn't based on protecting federal facilities. It was based on demonstrating personal power over citizens who couldn't challenge his authority. Thompson's methods had evolved over 15 years of unchecked power. He had learned to identify visitors who were unlikely to complain, immigrants who feared government retaliation, elderly citizens who were intimidated by authority, and minorities who had learned that challenging security procedures often led to escalated harassment. But Thompson had also learned to exploit the bureaucratic gaps that allowed his behavior to continue. Complaints against him were routinely dismissed as procedural disagreements. Witnesses to his abuse rarely came forward because they feared being banned from the courthouse, and supervisors who were supposed to provide oversight were too overwhelmed with administrative duties to investigate individual security incidents. Thompson's power had grown over 15 years because he understood that most people would accept unconstitutional treatment rather than fight a system that seemed designed to protect him. Today, that system was about to encounter someone who not only understood her constitutional rights, but had the authority to enforce them. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," Thompson said, his face flushed with the rage that had intimidated hundreds of courthouse visitors over 15 years. "You're going through additional screening, and you're going to do it without questioning my procedures." Justice Washington looked directly at Thompson's badge, noting every detail that would later become evidence in a federal investigation. She observed his aggressive posture, his raised voice and his complete disregard for the constitutional principles that governed his authority. "Chief Thompson," she said, using his title and name with the precision of someone who understood that details matter in constitutional proceedings, "I believe there may be some confusion about the legal standards that govern federal security procedures. Citizens have constitutional rights that don't disappear when they enter federal buildings. The use of his name and title should have been Thompson's first warning. Ordinary visitors didn't typically know how to read federal security insignia or identify ranking courthouse personnel. But Thompson was too angry to notice the warning signs that his 15 years of unchecked power were about to end. The other security officers were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Officer Jenkins had been at the courthouse for 8 years, and he had never seen anyone challenge Thompson's authority with such complete confidence. Officer Rodriguez was filming the interaction on his body camera, as per department protocol, but he was starting to realize that this footage might become evidence in a federal investigation. Officer Davis, who had witnessed dozens of Thompson's aggressive interactions with visitors, was beginning to feel sick as he recognized that this woman's knowledge of federal law was far beyond what any ordinary citizen would possess. Thompson was now standing less than 2 feet from Justice Washington, his hands clenched at his sides, his 15 years of unchecked authority conditioning him to expect immediate submission when he raised his voice. The fact that this woman remained calm and continued to cite constitutional law was driving him toward a rage that would prove catastrophic. "Lady, I don't care what you think you know about law," Thompson shouted, his voice echoing through the courthouse lobby. "You're in my building now, and you're going to follow my rules, or you're going to learn what happens to people who don't respect federal authority." Little did anyone know that this routine visit would expose a pattern of constitutional violations that had been hidden for over a decade. Because Justice Washington wasn't just any Supreme Court justice. She was conducting an informal review of courthouse security protocols after receiving anonymous complaints about abuse of authority, and she had been waiting for evidence of systematic constitutional violations. What happened next would be analyzed by constitutional scholars, replayed on news networks and studied in law schools as an example of how 15 years of unchecked government power can be destroyed by one moment of constitutional reckoning. Thompson was now in a rage that had been building for 15 years of unquestioned authority. Every citizen who had submitted to his intimidation, every visitor who had accepted his abuse, every supervisor who had ignored complaints against him, all of it had conditioned him to believe that his word was law and his authority was absolute. The fact that this black woman continued to cite constitutional principles while questioning his procedures was triggering every racist assumption that had fueled his 15-year career of abuse. In Thompson's worldview, there were people who deserved respect and people who needed to be reminded of their place. This woman clearly needed to learn her place. "Ma'am?" Thompson snarled, using the word like an insult. "You're about to learn that when I give instructions in this courthouse, you follow them. I don't care if you think you're some kind of lawyer or whatever." "Chief Thompson," Justice Washington interrupted, her voice maintaining the calm authority that had controlled Supreme Court proceedings for 5 years. "I am Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington, and you are currently violating multiple constitutional protections that govern federal security procedures." The words hit the other security officers like a physical shockwave. Officer Jenkins actually stepped backward. Officer Rodriguez's hand moved instinctively away from his equipment. Officer Davis looked around the lobby, as if seeing it for the first time, suddenly aware that every security camera in the federal building was recording this interaction. But Security Chief Thompson, his constitutional awareness clouded by 15 years of unchecked power and racial bias, heard only one thing: a black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do in his own courthouse. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England," Thompson shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You're in my security checkpoint, and you're going to show some respect for federal authority." Justice Washington remained motionless, but her constitutional training was working with the precision of the Supreme Court's most complex legal analysis. She was mentally cataloging every federal statute being violated, every constitutional principle being ignored, every procedural protection being denied. More importantly, She was acutely aware that everything happening was being recorded by multiple federal security systems that would preserve this constitutional violation forever. The transformation in the other security officers was visible and terrifying. They had gone from confident federal employees to men who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the end of their careers. Officer Rodriguez looked like he was going to be physically ill, as he understood that his body camera was recording what might be the most catastrophic constitutional violation in federal courthouse history. "Chief," Officer Jenkins said quietly, his voice barely audible, "maybe we should—" "Shut up, Jenkins," Thompson snapped, his authority addiction preventing him from recognizing that his 15-year career was about to be destroyed by constitutional consequences he couldn't even imagine. "Chief Thompson," Justice Washington said, making one final attempt to prevent the constitutional catastrophe she could see approaching, "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor and federal oversight before this situation escalates into a violation of constitutional authority that cannot be undone." Thompson heard those words as the ultimate challenge to the unchecked power he had wielded for 15 years. In his twisted logic, backing down now would represent a constitutional defeat that he could never recover from. The other officers were watching. The federal courthouse was surrounding him. This woman was questioning not just his procedures, but his very right to exercise federal authority. He made the decision that would destroy everything he had built over 15 years of government service. Thompson stepped forward, grabbed Justice Washington by her left arm, and violently shoved her backward against the metal detector with enough force to make her briefcase fall to the marble floor, scattering Supreme Court case files across the federal courthouse lobby. "You're going through additional screening whether you like it or not," he shouted, pressing his hand against her back while reaching for restraints that would never be applied. The sound of Justice Washington's briefcase hitting the marble floor echoed through the courthouse lobby like a constitutional alarm. Supreme Court documents scattered across the federal building. And in that moment, Security Chief Marcus Thompson crossed a constitutional line that would trigger consequences reaching the highest levels of American government. When the other courthouse staff realized who Security Chief Thompson had just attacked, their faces went white with terror. Because assaulting a Supreme Court justice isn't just a crime. It's a constitutional violation that automatically triggers federal investigation and can never be covered up. Officer Jenkins was the first to understand the constitutional magnitude of what had just occurred. As Justice Washington's Supreme Court case files scattered across the courthouse lobby, he could see the official seals, the constitutional case headers, the classified markings that indicated these weren't just any legal documents, they were active Supreme Court materials. "Chief," Jenkins whispered, his voice barely audible, "Chief, I think—" But Thompson was beyond constitutional reason. He had Justice Washington pressed against the metal detector, her hands positioned for restraint, completely convinced that he was teaching a necessary lesson about respecting federal authority. In his adrenaline-fueled state, he couldn't hear the constitutional horror in his officers' voices, or see the federal courthouse administrators who were now moving rapidly toward their location. Justice Washington, even with her face pressed against the cold metal of the security equipment, remained completely composed. Her years on the Supreme Court had taught her that constitutional panic was the enemy of justice, and that dignity under governmental pressure was often the most powerful weapon against tyranny. "Chief Thompson," she said, her voice muffled but still carrying supreme authority, "Employee ID 1847, your supervisor is Court Administrator James Morrison, extension 4477. The constitutional violation you are currently committing carries federal criminal penalties that cannot be plea bargained or administratively dismissed." The constitutional specificity of her knowledge hit the other officers like constitutional lightning. Ordinary citizens didn't know employee ID numbers, supervisory chains of federal command, or constitutional sentencing guidelines. Only someone with intimate knowledge of federal courthouse operations would have access to that kind of detailed constitutional information. Officer Rodriguez, who had been recording the entire interaction on his body camera, as per federal protocol, suddenly realized that he was documenting what might be the most catastrophic constitutional violation in federal courthouse history. His hands began shaking as he understood that this footage would likely be evidence in a Supreme Court case that would change federal security protocols forever. Officer Davis felt his constitutional understanding crumble as the pieces began falling into place. The briefcase full of Supreme Court documents, the perfect constitutional terminology, the complete lack of fear in the face of federal authority, the way she carried herself with absolute constitutional confidence, even while being physically restrained by federal security. "Oh my God," Davis whispered to Rodriguez. "She's really a Supreme Court justice." Rodriguez, still filming everything on his federal body camera, understood that he was recording constitutional history. This footage wouldn't just be evidence in Thompson's criminal case. It would be studied by constitutional scholars for generations as an example of how government power can abuse the very constitutional authority it's supposed to protect. Thompson, still pressing his authority against Justice Washington's constitutional dignity, finally heard something that penetrated his power-clouded consciousness. The sound of multiple federal vehicles approaching at high speed with emergency lights that signaled constitutional crisis. Federal courthouse administrators had been monitoring the security checkpoint from the moment constitutional tension began escalating. The Federal Protective Service, which provides constitutional security for all federal judicial personnel, had protocols for exactly this type of constitutional emergency. When a Supreme Court justice's constitutional safety was threatened, those protocols were activated automatically and without administrative discussion. 3 black federal SUVs with constitutional plates surrounded the courthouse entrance in less than 60 seconds. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged with weapons ready, not pointing them at anyone, but making it constitutionally clear that this situation had just escalated to a level that local security couldn't control. "Federal agents," announced Supervisory Special Agent Maria Santos from the U.S. Marshals Service, the federal agency responsible for protecting Supreme Court justices, "release the individual immediately and step away from the security equipment." Thompson looked up to see half a dozen federal agents surrounding him, their presence transforming what he had thought was routine security enforcement into something that looked like constitutional crisis management. For the first time since this constitutional confrontation began, doubt crept into his authority-addicted consciousness. "This woman was interfering with federal security," Thompson began, his voice carrying less authority than it had 5 minutes earlier. "Sir?" Agent Santos interrupted, her voice carrying absolute constitutional authority. "That woman is Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington. You need to remove your hands from her immediately and step back from all security equipment." The words Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington hit Thompson like constitutional artillery. He had heard that name before. Every federal employee in America knew that name. She was the justice who had written landmark constitutional decisions protecting citizen rights. She was the justice who had overseen constitutional cases that had reformed entire government agencies. She was the justice who had the constitutional power to place federal facilities under Supreme Court oversight. What happened next would trigger an investigation that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of federal courthouse administration, because what Security Chief Thompson didn't know was that assaulting a Supreme Court justice doesn't just end careers. It triggers constitutional protocols that can't be stopped, can't be covered up, and can't be ignored. And the evidence they were about to uncover would prove that this wasn't his first time abusing his authority. Within 4 minutes of Agent Santos identifying Justice Washington, a series of constitutional protocols began activating that would ultimately involve 6 different federal agencies: the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Supreme Court's Administrative Office, and the Constitutional Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Federal Protective Service Protocol FPS 1847 required immediate notification of any threat to Supreme Court personnel. U.S. Marshal Service Protocol USMS 1847 mandated full constitutional investigation of any physical assault on a Supreme Court justice. FBI Protocol FBI CR 1847 triggered automatic constitutional rights violation review for any use of force against Supreme Court authority by federal employees. Security Chief Thompson stood frozen as he watched his 15-year career disintegrating through constitutional mechanisms he didn't even know existed. Justice Washington, now surrounded by federal agents who treated her with the constitutional deference due to Supreme Court authority, began the legal process that would ultimately lead to his complete destruction. "Agent Santos," Justice Washington said, her voice returning to its normal judicial tone, "I'll need Incident Report FBI 1847 ATL to be filed within the constitutional hour. Chief Thompson violated constitutional protections under federal civil rights statutes and potentially multiple Supreme Court security protocols. I'll also need the constitutional evidence secured from courthouse cameras 7, 12, and 15, which have overlapping coverage of this entire constitutional violation." Thompson watched in growing constitutional horror as Justice Washington demonstrated exactly how much Supreme Court power she wielded. She wasn't just reciting law, she was activating constitutional machinery that he didn't even know existed. Every protocol she mentioned would generate federal reports that would be read by constitutional prosecutors. Every camera she referenced would provide constitutional evidence that couldn't be suppressed or administratively dismissed. Officer Jenkins approached his chief with obvious constitutional reluctance. "Chief, we should probably contact Court Administrator Morrison right away." Thompson nodded numbly, finally understanding that this constitutional situation was completely beyond his security authority. But what he didn't know was that Court Administrator Morrison had already been contacted, not by Thompson's security team, but by the Federal Protective Service, who had constitutional notification protocols that bypassed local administrative structures entirely. Morrison's phone had been ringing for 3 minutes when Thompson finally called. "Morrison here. Court Administrator, this is Security Chief Thompson. We have a constitutional situation at the main security checkpoint that—" "Thompson," Morrison interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled constitutional panic. "Please tell me you did not just assault Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington." The constitutional silence on Thompson's end told Morrison everything he needed to know about the Supreme Court crisis that was about to engulf the entire federal facility. "Thompson, where are you right now?" "I'm at the security checkpoint with federal agents and—" "Do not say another word over this federal communication channel," Morrison snapped. "I'm en route with Constitutional Legal Counsel. Do not speak to anyone. Do not make any constitutional statements. And do not leave the federal facility until I arrive with Supreme Court Crisis Management." But Morrison knew it was already constitutionally too late. Federal assault charges against government employees who attacked Supreme Court justices weren't handled by local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. They were handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, where Justice Washington had constitutional relationships with every prosecutor and where Thompson's 15-year security career meant absolutely nothing in the face of Supreme Court authority. Justice Washington was now speaking quietly with Agent Santos, providing a detailed constitutional account of the incident that would become the foundation for federal criminal charges. Her memory for constitutional detail was legendary in legal circles. She could recall Supreme Court conversations verbatim years after they occurred, and her constitutional credibility with federal prosecutors was absolute. "Agent Santos, you should know that Chief Thompson displayed a pattern of constitutional behavior that suggests this wasn't an isolated security incident," Justice Washington said. "His immediate assumption that I was just another difficult visitor who needed to be taught respect indicates systematic constitutional violations within this federal facility's security operations." Those words, systematic constitutional violations and security operations, were federal code for the kind of Supreme Court investigation that could place entire courthouse facilities under constitutional oversight. Thompson, standing 20 feet away, could hear enough of the constitutional conversation to understand that Justice Washington wasn't just filing criminal charges against him personally. She was triggering a comprehensive constitutional review of his entire 15-year security operation. But what they didn't realize was that everything was being recorded, not just by courthouse security cameras, but by federal monitoring systems that capture every interaction involving Supreme Court justices, and these recordings are automatically sent to constitutional oversight agencies that can never be influenced or suppressed. Court Administrator James Morrison arrived at the federal courthouse with the facility's constitutional legal counsel, Attorney David Richardson, expecting to manage a relatively routine security complaint. What they found instead was a Supreme Court crime scene with constitutional evidence technicians photographing security equipment and federal agents collecting Justice Washington's scattered Supreme Court documents as constitutional evidence. Morrison had known Thompson for 12 years. They had managed security protocols together, covered for each other during administrative reviews, and shared an understanding about how to handle problematic constitutional complaints from courthouse visitors. But seeing Thompson standing next to his security checkpoint with federal agents documenting every constitutional detail of the scene, Morrison realized that their network of administrative protection was about to be tested by Supreme Court authority. "Security Chief Thompson," Morrison said carefully, aware that federal agents were recording every constitutional word, "you are relieved of all security duties pending constitutional investigation. Richardson will handle all federal communications from this point forward." Attorney Richardson was sweating, despite the cool courthouse air conditioning. He specialized in federal employee defense, but his experience was entirely with administrative prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate constitutional settlements. Supreme Court criminal charges were a completely different constitutional world, a world where political considerations and professional relationships meant nothing, and where the constitutional evidence either supported charges or it didn't. "Your Honor," Richardson approached Justice Washington with obvious constitutional reluctance. "I'm David Richardson, representing Security Chief Thompson. I was hoping we might discuss constitutional—" "Mr. Richardson," Justice Washington interrupted with Supreme Court authority, "this is now a federal constitutional matter involving assault on Supreme Court personnel. Any communications should go through the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Supreme Court's Administrative Office." Richardson's face went constitutionally pale. Federal constitutional matter meant FBI investigation, federal grand jury, and potential federal prison time for attacking Supreme Court authority. It meant that Thompson's case would be handled by federal prosecutors who specialized in constitutional violations and who viewed attacks on Supreme Court justices as the highest priority area for prosecution. Agent Santos was now coordinating with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had just arrived from the Atlanta field office with a mobile constitutional forensic unit. The FBI's involvement meant that this case would receive the full resources of federal constitutional law enforcement, resources that could uncover patterns of security abuse going back 15 years. "Agent Walsh," Justice Washington said with Supreme Court precision, "I believe you'll want to review Security Chief Thompson's entire disciplinary record as part of your constitutional investigation. Based on his behavior today, I suspect you'll find a pattern of constitutional violations that this facility's administration has failed to address." Agent Walsh nodded, making constitutional notes that would trigger federal subpoenas for Thompson's security file, internal affairs records, and every constitutional complaint filed against him in his 15-year federal career. Constitutional investigators had access to records that local oversight agencies often ignored or administratively suppressed. Thompson watched this Supreme Court conversation with growing constitutional desperation. He could see his entire federal life being systematically dismantled by constitutional agents who operated with resources and Supreme Court authority that local investigators couldn't match. Every security complaint he thought had been buried, every visitor who had been intimidated into constitutional silence, every piece of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from administrative files, all of it would be reviewed by federal agents who couldn't be influenced by local courthouse politics. Morrison was now coordinating with Chief Judge Robert Hayes, who had been awakened at home and informed that his facility's security chief had assaulted a Supreme Court justice. Hayes understood immediately that this constitutional incident would trigger federal oversight of his entire courthouse, oversight that could result in Supreme Court-ordered reforms, federal constitutional monitoring, and budget restrictions that would last for years. "Morrison," Hayes said over the constitutional phone line, "I need a complete timeline of every constitutional complaint against Thompson for the past 5 years. I need it by morning, and I need it to be comprehensive. The FBI is going to request it anyway, and I want to know what constitutional violations they're going to find before they find them." But Morrison knew that compiling Thompson's complete constitutional record would be like documenting a pattern of security abuse that the facility had systematically ignored. Every complaint that had been administratively dismissed, every visitor interview that had been perfunctory, every internal investigation that had concluded with insufficient constitutional evidence, all of it would now be reviewed by federal agents who understood exactly how federal facilities protected problematic security personnel. The courthouse administration thought they could contain this, but they had no idea how deep Thompson's pattern of intimidation went. Because Justice Washington had been quietly documenting security protocol violations for months, and she had been waiting for evidence of systematic abuse to trigger comprehensive constitutional reform. By 5:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after Thompson had first grabbed Justice Washington's arm, federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office were already reviewing preliminary constitutional evidence and preparing federal charges that would be filed within 24 hours. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres was the Constitutional Rights Division's specialist in federal employee misconduct cases. He had successfully prosecuted 63 government employees for constitutional violations in his 14-year career. When his phone rang at 5:15 p.m. with news that a security chief had assaulted Supreme Court Justice Patricia Washington, Torres knew this would be the highest-profile constitutional case of his professional life. "Justice Washington," Torres said when he called her secure constitutional line, "I've reviewed the preliminary FBI constitutional report. We'll be filing federal charges under constitutional civil rights statutes and federal assault provisions. Given your status as a Supreme Court justice and the clear constitutional evidence of systematic security abuse, we'll be recommending the maximum federal penalty range." The federal constitutional statutes carried maximum sentences that reflected the severity of attacking Supreme Court authority. Combined, these charges could result in 8 years in federal prison, complete forfeiture of federal benefits, and permanent prohibition from any government employment. Justice Washington understood the constitutional significance of Torres's call. Federal prosecutors didn't call Supreme Court justices to discuss charging decisions unless they were completely confident in their ability to secure constitutional convictions. Torres was calling because he wanted Justice Washington to know that Thompson would face the full weight of constitutional justice. Meanwhile, at FBI Constitutional Headquarters in Atlanta, Special Agent Walsh was compiling Thompson's 15-year record of security complaints, constitutional violations, and administrative actions. What she discovered was a pattern of constitutional abuse so comprehensive that it suggested systematic failure by the courthouse's constitutional oversight mechanisms. 57 complaints of excessive security procedures, 32 allegations of constitutional bias, 21 lawsuits settled by the federal government with confidential agreements, 9 internal affairs investigations that concluded with insufficient constitutional evidence, despite compelling witness testimony, a pattern of constitutional behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago, but had instead been enabled and protected by administrators who valued institutional loyalty over constitutional accountability. Agent Walsh's constitutional report would ultimately trigger a federal pattern and practice investigation that would place the entire courthouse under Supreme Court oversight and mandate comprehensive constitutional reforms that would cost millions of federal dollars and take years to implement. Thompson, meanwhile, was at home in his suburban ranch house, staring at his Federal Security Academy graduation photo and trying to understand how 15 years of what he considered successful courthouse protection had led to this constitutional moment. His wife, Linda, was crying quietly in their bedroom, already understanding that their middle-class lifestyle, their children's college funds, and their federal retirement plans had been destroyed by one moment of constitutional arrogance. Thompson's phone had been ringing constantly since word of the Supreme Court incident spread through the federal facility. Fellow security officers, administrators, and union representatives all wanted to know what had happened and how bad the constitutional damage would be. But Thompson couldn't explain how he had confused a Supreme Court justice for a random visitor, couldn't justify why he had used force against someone who had never threatened federal security, and couldn't rationalize why he had ignored every constitutional warning sign that should have told him to stop. The Federal Security Union's attorney, Sarah Martinez, had reviewed the preliminary constitutional evidence and delivered news that shattered Thompson's last constitutional hope. "Marcus, this isn't a case we can defend constitutionally. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is a Supreme Court justice, and the FBI has constitutional video of everything. My advice is to negotiate for the minimum federal sentence and hope the constitutional prosecutors are feeling generous. But constitutional prosecutors rarely felt generous when federal employees violated the civil rights of Supreme Court justices. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a constitutional reputation to maintain, and prosecuting corrupt federal security was always popular with constitutional oversight organizations and civil rights advocates. Chief Judge Hayes was now meeting with federal mediators to discuss the terms of Supreme Court oversight that would be imposed on the courthouse. The constitutional incident with Justice Washington had accelerated investigations that had been building for years, and the facility was facing federal intervention that would reshape every aspect of security operations. What the federal investigation uncovered would shock the entire judicial system, because Thompson's 15-year security career wasn't built on protecting the courthouse. It was built on intimidating visitors, abusing authority, and creating an atmosphere of fear that violated constitutional principles. Federal constitutional investigators had been working for 24 hours straight when they uncovered evidence that transformed Thompson's case from a single incident of Supreme Court assault into a federal conspiracy investigation involving multiple security officers and administrators. FBI agent Walsh had been analyzing Thompson's security personnel file when she noticed a constitutional pattern that made her stomach turn. Every single complaint against Thompson had been investigated by the same internal affairs detective, Lieutenant Michael Foster. Every single constitutional investigation had concluded with insufficient evidence. Every single witness had mysteriously become unavailable or unreliable during the administrative investigation process. Foster had been protecting Thompson for 12 years, and their constitutional arrangement had generated millions of dollars in federal settlements that the government had paid to avoid Supreme Court scrutiny. Walsh's discovery meant that Foster would also face federal charges for conspiracy to violate constitutional rights. The constitutional evidence was overwhelming. Email records showed Foster had coached Thompson on how to write security incident reports that would withstand constitutional scrutiny. Phone records revealed coordination between Foster and Thompson before internal affairs interviews. Financial records indicated that Thompson had helped Foster obtain promotions by providing false testimony in other security officers' disciplinary hearings. At 6:30 a.m., federal agents arrested Lieutenant Foster at his home in Marietta, Georgia. The constitutional arrest warrant was based on evidence that Foster had systematically suppressed investigations into Thompson's constitutional misconduct for over a decade. Foster's arrest meant that other administrators who had participated in the constitutional cover-up network would also face federal charges. Justice Washington had been monitoring the constitutional investigation's progress through regular updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Each new constitutional revelation confirmed her understanding that Thompson's behavior represented institutional failure, not individual security misconduct. Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres, Justice Washington said during their morning constitutional call, I want to ensure that this investigation addresses the systemic issues that enabled Security Chief Thompson's behavior for 15 years. Individual constitutional prosecution is important, but institutional reform is essential for protecting Supreme Court authority. Torres understood that Justice Washington was positioning this case as a catalyst for comprehensive federal courthouse reform. Her influence with constitutional oversight agencies would ensure that Thompson's prosecution led to long-term changes in federal security accountability throughout the judicial system. The local news media had picked up the Supreme Court story by morning, but they completely misunderstood its constitutional significance. Local reporters focused on Thompson's arrest and the assault charges, missing the larger story of federal investigation into systematic constitutional violations in federal courthouse security. But national constitutional news organizations understood exactly what was happening. CNN's Supreme Court correspondent reported that the Thompson case was likely to trigger the most comprehensive federal investigation of courthouse security misconduct since the establishment of federal judicial oversight. The Washington Post's constitutional rights reporter described it as a textbook example of how individual constitutional incidents can expose institutional failures that threaten Supreme Court authority. Thompson woke up in his suburban bedroom to discover that his name was trending on constitutional Twitter. His photograph was being shown on national television, and civil rights organizations were using his case as an example of everything wrong with federal security authority. Dr. Angela Davis, the renowned constitutional rights activist, issued a statement that captured the national significance. Security Chief Thompson's assault on Justice Washington represents the collision between America's legacy of governmental oppression and the constitutional authority that protects our democracy. When federal security officers believe they can assault Supreme Court justices with impunity, our entire system of constitutional justice is under attack. Thompson's defense attorney, David Richardson, was struggling to find any viable constitutional defense strategy. Federal civil rights cases involving Supreme Court justices were notoriously difficult to defend because they focused on clear constitutional violations rather than complex legal interpretations. The constitutional evidence against Thompson was captured on multiple federal cameras, witnessed by federal agents, and documented by one of the most respected constitutional authorities in American history. Marcus, Richardson said during their morning constitutional meeting, the federal prosecutors are offering a plea agreement, 6 years in federal prison, in exchange for cooperation in the constitutional investigation of Lieutenant Foster and other administrators. Here's the best constitutional deal you're going to get. Thompson stared at the plea agreement that would destroy everything he had built over 15 years of federal service. 6 years in federal prison meant losing his federal pension, his security benefits, and any hope of future employment in government service. But fighting the constitutional charges meant risking the maximum sentence of 8 years, and Richardson had made it clear that winning at constitutional trial was virtually impossible. The constitutional investigation was expanding beyond Thompson and Foster to include other security officers who had participated in the constitutional cover-up network. Federal agents were reviewing every security case Thompson had worked, every constitutional complaint he had dismissed, and every incident report he had filed. Dozens of federal cases were being overturned as evidence of Thompson's pattern of constitutional misconduct came to light. The evidence was overwhelming, but Thompson's final downfall was yet to come. Because when federal investigators examine courthouse security violations, they don't just look at one guard. They examine the entire administrative system that allowed him to operate unchecked for 15 years. And what they found would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of federal courthouse administration. 8 weeks after the assault, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a comprehensive federal indictment that shocked even experienced constitutional attorneys with its scope and constitutional detail. United States vs. Marcus Thompson, Michael Foster, and James Morrison included charges under 5 different federal statutes: conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law, assault on Supreme Court personnel, obstruction of constitutional justice, and racketeering conspiracy under federal RICO statutes. The racketeering charges were based on constitutional evidence that Thompson, Foster, and Morrison had operated an organized scheme to protect each other from constitutional accountability while systematically violating citizens' constitutional rights. Federal prosecutors had documented over 150 constitutional incidents where the 3 men had covered up security misconduct, falsified federal reports, and intimidated constitutional witnesses. Justice Washington attended the arraignment hearing, sitting in the public gallery as Thompson, Foster, and Morrison were formally charged with federal constitutional crimes. The courtroom was packed with constitutional journalists, civil rights activists, and federal prosecutors who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in Supreme Court accountability. Federal Judge Thomas Bradley, who presided over the constitutional arraignment, set bond conditions that effectively ended all 3 men's federal careers immediately. Thompson was required to surrender his security badge, his federal weapon, and his government security certification. He was prohibited from contact with any current or former federal employees who might be constitutional witnesses in the case. Mr. Thompson, Judge Bradley said from the constitutional bench, the allegations in this indictment describe a pattern of behavior that strikes at the heart of our constitutional system and Supreme Court authority. The court considers you a significant flight risk and a constitutional danger to the community. Thompson's bond was set at $750,000, secured by his house and requiring GPS constitutional monitoring. The conditions meant he would spend the months before constitutional trial under house arrest, watching his former colleagues testify against him in exchange for reduced federal sentences. The psychological constitutional impact on Thompson was devastating. 15 years of believing he was constitutionally untouchable had been shattered by one moment of contact with someone who possessed real Supreme Court authority. He spent his days under house arrest, reading constitutional news coverage of his case, watching former partners distance themselves from him, and realizing that his entire identity as a federal security officer had been built on systematic violations of the constitutional law he was supposed to protect. Linda Thompson filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the constitutional arraignment. Their children changed their last names to avoid association with their father's constitutional crimes. Thompson's federal security pension was suspended pending the outcome of constitutional charges, leaving him financially dependent on relatives who were increasingly reluctant to help someone who had attacked Supreme Court authority. Justice Washington, meanwhile, was working with federal constitutional oversight agencies to implement comprehensive reforms in federal courthouse security. Her constitutional recommendations would become the template for federal intervention in security agencies nationwide. The Thompson case represents an opportunity to transform federal security accountability. Justice Washington told the Federal Constitutional Monitor appointed to oversee courthouse reforms. We must ensure that this type of systematic constitutional misconduct never again receives institutional protection, especially when it threatens Supreme Court authority. The constitutional reforms Justice Washington advocated were revolutionary. Mandatory body cameras for all federal security officers, independent constitutional oversight of excessive force complaints, Supreme Court review of all security use of force incidents, and automatic termination for security officers with patterns of constitutional misconduct. These changes would cost the federal government millions of dollars, but would prevent future Marcus Thompsons from operating with constitutional impunity. Federal prosecutors were also pursuing constitutional civil asset forfeiture against Thompson's property, arguing that his house and savings had been purchased with income from his corrupt federal security career. The constitutional forfeiture action meant that even if Thompson somehow avoided federal prison time, he would lose everything he had accumulated over 15 years of constitutional violations. The national constitutional rights community was watching Thompson's case as a test of federal commitment to Supreme Court accountability. Organizations like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Constitutional Defense Fund filed amicus briefs supporting maximum sentences and comprehensive constitutional reforms. Reverend Al Sharpton issued a constitutional statement that captured the broader significance. Marcus Thompson thought he could assault a Supreme Court justice because he had spent 15 years assaulting citizens without constitutional consequences. Federal prosecution is the only way to break the cycle of governmental impunity that has protected security officers like Thompson for generations while threatening Supreme Court authority. But the consequences were only beginning, because losing his job was just the start. Thompson was about to face federal criminal charges for assaulting the highest judicial authority in America, charges that carried a minimum of 5 years in federal prison, and Justice Washington had one final constitutional move that would ensure he could never abuse federal authority again. The federal pattern and practice constitutional investigation triggered by Thompson's assault had uncovered evidence of corruption so extensive that the Department of Justice placed the entire federal courthouse under Supreme Court oversight, only the 6th time in U.S. history that such drastic constitutional action had been taken. Federal Constitutional Monitor Dr. Sarah Washington, no relation to Justice Washington, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in constitutional courthouse reform, was appointed to oversee comprehensive changes that would reshape every aspect of federal security operations. Her constitutional mandate included complete restructuring of internal affairs, implementation of community constitutional oversight mechanisms, and Supreme Court review of all hiring and promotion decisions. The evidence uncovered in the Thompson constitutional investigation reveals institutional failure at every level, Dr. Washington announced at her first public constitutional meeting. This courthouse has systematically protected security officers who violated citizens' constitutional rights while retaliating against employees who attempted to report constitutional misconduct. The financial cost of constitutional oversight was staggering. The federal government was required to pay for Dr. Washington's team of constitutional monitors, implement new constitutional training programs for all security officers, upgrade technology systems to ensure constitutional accountability, and settle hundreds of constitutional rights lawsuits that had been filed as the scope of courthouse corruption became clear. Chief Judge Hayes faced a constitutional budget crisis that threatened courthouse services as millions of federal dollars were redirected to comply with Supreme Court oversight requirements. The constitutional consequences were swift. 3 courthouse administrators who had supported the Security Department's resistance to constitutional reform were transferred to non-security positions by federal order. Justice Washington was appointed to the Federal Constitutional Advisory Committee on Courthouse Reform, a position that gave her national influence over federal security accountability policies. Her experience with the Thompson case made her a leading constitutional expert on how Supreme Court oversight could transform corrupt federal security departments. The Thompson case proves that individual constitutional prosecution must be combined with institutional reform. Justice Washington testified before the Senate Judiciary Constitutional Committee. We cannot simply arrest corrupt security officers. We must dismantle the systems that protect and enable their constitutional corruption. Her congressional constitutional testimony led to the Federal Courthouse Security Accountability Act, legislation that would require all federal security agencies to implement constitutional oversight mechanisms similar to those developed in response to Thompson's constitutional crimes. Thompson's former colleagues were cooperating with federal constitutional investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, providing evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of federal courthouse administration. The constitutional investigation expanded to include administrators who had blocked security reform, prosecutors who had refused to file constitutional charges against problem officers, and judges who had dismissed cases based on prosecutorial pressure rather than constitutional evidence. Officer Rodriguez, the security guard who had witnessed Thompson's constitutional assault on Justice Washington, became a federal constitutional whistleblower whose testimony helped convict 12 additional security officers of constitutional violations. His cooperation agreement included federal witness protection and relocation assistance, recognition that testifying against corrupt constitutional colleagues had made him a target for retaliation. Rodriguez did what every federal security officer swears to do, Justice Washington said, at his constitutional commendation ceremony. He chose to protect and serve the Constitution rather than protect and serve constitutional corruption. The federal security union that had initially defended Thompson was forced to implement new constitutional policies prohibiting the defense of officers charged with federal constitutional violations. Union leadership was replaced by constitutional reformers who committed to supporting accountability rather than institutional impunity. Constitutional oversight was producing measurable results. Excessive constitutional force complaints dropped by 73%, citizen satisfaction with federal security services increased by 52%, and federal prosecutors reported a significant reduction in constitutional violations by courthouse security officers. But the human constitutional cost of Thompson's crimes continued to mount. Families who had been victimized by Thompson during his 15-year federal career were filing constitutional rights lawsuits seeking millions of dollars in damages. Each lawsuit provided additional constitutional evidence of the systematic failure that had enabled Thompson's behavior. Maria Rodriguez, whose elderly father had been brutalized by Thompson 2 years earlier, testified at federal constitutional hearings about the long-term impact of security misconduct. "My father still has nightmares about what Security Chief Thompson did to him, but knowing that Thompson will never hurt another family gives us some constitutional peace." The constitutional transformation was not without resistance. Security officers who had benefited from the old system of constitutional impunity organized protests against federal oversight, claiming that accountability measures were making federal security impossible. But community support for constitutional reform was overwhelming, and political leaders who opposed Supreme Court oversight were voted out of office. The changes were revolutionary, but Thompson's personal reckoning was still coming, because Justice Washington had one final constitutional move that would ensure he could never abuse federal authority again. On a cold morning in March, 10 months after he had assaulted Justice Washington, Marcus Thompson stood before federal Judge Thomas Bradley to receive a sentence that would destroy what remained of his constitutional life. The federal courthouse was packed with constitutional rights activists, victims of Thompson's security abuse, and journalists covering what had become the most significant federal security accountability case in American constitutional history. Justice Washington sat in the front row, a visible reminder of the Supreme Court dignity and authority that Thompson had tried to violate. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres presented constitutional evidence that painted Thompson as the centerpiece of a corrupt network that had victimized hundreds of citizens over 15 years. The constitutional sentencing memorandum included victim impact statements from 63 people who had been brutalized, falsely detained, or intimidated by Thompson and his constitutional confederates. Your Honor, Torres said with constitutional gravity, Marcus Thompson used his federal badge and authority to terrorize citizens who couldn't fight back. He believed that his government uniform made him untouchable, that his federal authority superseded the Constitution, and that his victims were powerless to hold him accountable. He was constitutionally wrong on every count. Thompson's constitutional defense attorney made a final desperate plea for leniency, arguing that Thompson had been a product of systemic constitutional problems rather than individual malice. But federal Judge Bradley had reviewed 15 years of constitutional evidence showing that Thompson had been the architect of the corruption, not its victim. Mr. Thompson, Judge Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority, you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the foundation of our constitutional democratic system. Federal security officers who violate citizens' constitutional rights and assault Supreme Court justices are not law enforcement. They are criminals who happen to wear federal badges. The constitutional sentence was devastating. 7 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised constitutional release, forfeiture of all assets obtained through corrupt federal activities, and permanent prohibition from any government employment. Thompson would serve his time in federal constitutional facilities designed for corrupt government officials, where his fellow inmates would include other federal security officers, politicians, and public servants who had betrayed their constitutional oaths. Justice Washington watched Thompson's constitutional sentencing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice delivered through proper constitutional processes. But her focus was already shifting to the systemic constitutional changes that would prevent future Marcus Thompsons from operating with federal impunity. This sentence sends a clear constitutional message, Justice Washington told reporters after the constitutional hearing. No one is above the law, not federal security officers, not government officials, and certainly not those who use their authority to violate the constitutional rights they swore to protect. Thompson's personal constitutional destruction was complete. His wife had divorced him and moved to another state with their children. His house had been seized through federal constitutional forfeiture proceedings. His federal security pension had been permanently terminated. His government security certification had been permanently revoked. Friends and family members had distanced themselves from him to avoid association with his constitutional crimes. The psychological constitutional impact was evident as Thompson was led away in federal shackles. The man who had spent 15 years believing he was constitutionally untouchable now faced 7 years in federal prison, where his status as a corrupt federal security officer would make him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by government authority. Lieutenant Foster received 6 years in federal prison for his constitutional role in covering up Thompson's crimes. Court Administrator Morrison received 5 years for participating in the constitutional conspiracy. 14 other security officers received sentences ranging from probation to 4 years in prison for their roles in the constitutional corruption network. The federal constitutional investigation had ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 27 federal security officers, the largest courthouse corruption case in American constitutional history. The financial cost to the federal government exceeded $75 million in constitutional oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and reform implementation. Justice Washington's constitutional role in exposing this corruption earned her national recognition as a champion of Supreme Court accountability. She received the Constitutional Rights Award from the NAACP, the Constitutional Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and was featured on the cover of Constitutional Quarterly as one of the most influential people fighting government constitutional corruption. But for Justice Washington, the real constitutional victory was not the awards or recognition. It was the knowledge that systematic constitutional reforms would protect future citizens from experiencing what she had endured in that courthouse security checkpoint. The federal constitutional monitoring of the courthouse would continue for 7 years, ensuring that the changes were permanent rather than temporary. New security officers were trained in constitutional law and civil rights. Supervisors were held constitutionally accountable for their subordinates' behavior. Community oversight provided external constitutional accountability that prevented the return of corrupt practices. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, because Justice Washington's response to this assault would inspire federal legislation that would change courthouse security protocols nationwide and protect constitutional authority forever. 2 years after Marcus Thompson's constitutional assault had triggered the largest federal security reform in American judicial history, Justice Washington stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about legislation that would transform federal courthouse security accountability nationwide. The Federal Courthouse Security Constitutional Accountability Act, inspired directly by the Thompson case, would require all federal security agencies to implement constitutional oversight mechanisms, body camera requirements, and independent constitutional investigation procedures for excessive force complaints. The legislation represented the most comprehensive federal security reform in American constitutional history. Senators, Justice Washington testified with Supreme Court authority, Marcus Thompson's assault on my constitutional dignity was also an assault on the constitutional principles that govern our democracy, but his constitutional crime became an opportunity to demonstrate that our system of justice, when properly applied, can hold even the most powerful government employees accountable and protect even the highest constitutional authorities. The Constitutional Committee room was silent as Justice Washington described the systematic corruption that had protected Thompson for 15 years and the federal constitutional intervention that had finally brought justice. Her testimony was broadcast live on national constitutional television, watched by millions of Americans who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in constitutional civil rights. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked the constitutional question that captured the national significance. Justice Washington, what would have happened if you had been an ordinary citizen rather than a Supreme Court justice when Security Chief Thompson assaulted you? Justice Washington's answer was devastating in its constitutional simplicity. Senator, Marcus Thompson had assaulted ordinary citizens for 15 years without facing any constitutional consequences. The only difference was that I had the Supreme Court authority to trigger federal constitutional intervention and the knowledge to ensure that intervention was constitutionally effective. That constitutional exchange became the defining moment of the hearings, crystallizing public understanding that federal security accountability required external constitutional oversight rather than internal administrative investigation. The Federal Courthouse Security Constitutional Accountability Act passed the Senate by a vote of 82 to 18, with bipartisan support that reflected national consensus on the need for constitutional reform. President Biden signed the constitutional legislation into law 8 months later, with Justice Washington standing beside him as he used multiple constitutional pens to ensure that pieces of the signing could be distributed to civil rights organizations across the country. This law ensures that what happened to Justice Washington and what Marcus Thompson did to hundreds of victims over 15 years can never again receive institutional protection. President Biden said at the constitutional signing ceremony. This legislation protects Supreme Court authority and ensures constitutional accountability in federal security. The Thompson case had become a constitutional template for federal intervention in corrupt courthouse security agencies. The Department of Justice used the constitutional precedent to place 18 additional federal courthouses under Supreme Court oversight, applying the same comprehensive constitutional reforms that had transformed Thompson's courthouse. Marcus Thompson was serving his federal constitutional sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, a medium security facility that housed corrupt government officials. Prison records indicated that he had been attacked twice by inmates who had been victimized by federal security officers, confirming the constitutional dangers faced by government employees who became federal prisoners. His constitutional appeals had been denied by every court, including the Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case. Constitutional legal experts noted that Thompson's conviction was so clear-cut and the constitutional evidence so overwhelming that no appellate court was willing to question federal prosecutors' handling of the Supreme Court case. Justice Washington continued her constitutional work on security reform through her position on the Federal Constitutional Advisory Committee, helping to implement the accountability mechanisms that would prevent future Marcus Thompsons from operating with constitutional impunity. Her constitutional recommendations were being implemented in federal security agencies across the country. The financial constitutional settlements with Thompson's victims totaled over $45 million, paid by the federal government through insurance policies that had become prohibitively expensive as a result of the systematic constitutional misconduct. The insurance constitutional crisis forced additional reforms as companies refused to cover federal security agencies without comprehensive constitutional accountability measures. Maria Rodriguez, whose elderly father had been brutalized by Thompson, spoke at the Federal Courthouse Security Constitutional Accountability Act signing ceremony. Justice Washington showed us that constitutional dignity and courage can overcome hatred and corruption. Because of her constitutional strength, my father lived to see a world where federal security officers know they will be held constitutionally accountable for their actions. The constitutional transformation was visible in security statistics, community relations, and officer behavior. The courthouse that had once protected Marcus Thompson was now recognized as a national model for constitutional federal security, with community trust ratings that were the highest in the constitutional region. Justice Washington's final words at the Senate constitutional hearing captured the lasting significance of her encounter with Marcus Thompson. What began as one man's constitutional assault on Supreme Court authority has become a catalyst for constitutional transformation. We have proven that our system of justice, properly applied, can protect the vulnerable, hold the powerful constitutionally accountable, and ensure that federal badge and uniform serve the Constitution rather than corrupt those who wear them. And that's how one moment of constitutional disrespect against a Supreme Court justice destroyed a 15-year federal career, exposed systematic corruption, triggered comprehensive constitutional reform, and proved that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above constitutional law. Marcus Thompson thought he could assault Justice Washington with federal impunity. Instead, he learned that some people hold Supreme Court power he never imagined, and disrespecting constitutional authority carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. Thanks to everyone who typed respect, justice, and inspired in the comments. Your engagement proves that stories of constitutional dignity and accountability matter. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of courage triumphing over corruption. Until next time, remember that no one is above the law, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to back down.